Hello, everyone. We are back with you to deliver a fascinating breakthrough message to help increase your power performance in your lives, business owners, and anyone who's listening. My name is Christopher Thomas, and I have been very excited about today's video and our guest. She is sure to bring some more power profit, into everyone who is tuned in their lives and their businesses and also into their careers. And I have known this woman for several years now, have had some wonderful times, interaction, business, and also socially as well. And it's Dr. Maranda Griffin. How you doing, Dr. Griffin?
I'm good, Chris. Thank you so much for the invitation and the opportunity.
You're welcome. I get in the habit of calling you Maranda, but for video's sake, and since we're speaking about some things in regards to your field, we certainly got to make sure I continue to use Dr. Griffin, on this. So just for video world, I may slip up and say Maranda, but it's certainly Dr. Griffin. And speaking of that, let's go into Dr. Griffin's actually just a snapshot of her bio. Dr. Griffin has been described as the leader's leader, coach's coach, friend's friend, and the champion's champion. She's been formally trained in counseling education, counseling and psychology, elementary education. She prides herself on bringing out the best in others. She has worked at the federal, state, and community level. Among her noted accomplishments, she has secured multi-million-dollar grants, managed multi-million-dollar budgets, fostered systems change, developed and implemented funding allocation models, and have spoken on national, state, and community conferences. What I didn't know, Dr. Maranda, is that you were in the Air National Guard. It sounds like you know how to handle things.
Yes, I was. I'm retired now and happy to be retired.
Okay. All right. That's great. So, we appreciate your time, and so we'll be very conscious, of it. So let's dig right in. A few days ago, I came across some information that Michelle Obama mentioned about herself, which she was diagnosed with a low-grade depression. I found that very interesting. Help us, Dr. Griffin, to understand what is low-grade depression and how can people combat it?
Certainly. I'm so glad that she is using her platform to raise awareness of mental health issues, because there's so much stigma in our communities around mental health. When you hear the term low-grade depression, one of the things to be mindful of is from the medical profession as well as the counseling profession. Depression is based on a single episode or a recurrent event. When we look at depression, we look at it based on its. So when you hear the term low grade, from my standpoint, what that is equivalent to from a diagnostic perspective is mild depression. So it's the lowest available severity qualifier for someone that has depression. And so when you think about depression, there's certain signs and symptoms to be mindful of. Naturally, you would have a more depressed mood than normal. Depression impacts sleep, meaning that you would experience some sleep difficulties. People who are depressed often have a low or dulled interest in things that they once found pleasure in. So maybe external activities, socialization opportunities. people with depression are easily fatigued. That's one of the indicators that sometimes people don't think about. People that suffer from depression experience changes in their weight. So people could either lose weight or they gain weight. Most of the time there's a thought of a bit of worthlessness, or self-concept and image are impacted. Depression cognitively can impact one's ability to concentrate. And some of the more severe symptoms of depression are recurrent thoughts around death or suicide. One of the things people are not aware of is that women are 2 times more likely to develop depression than men when we look across genders. In our lifetime, it's said statistically that 1 in 10 people will suffer from depression. Again, that could be a single episode. It could be recurrent. It could potentially not meet the clinical or medical threshold for diagnoses. Some people are more prone to depression than others based on a family history of either depression or other mental health disorders that are similar in nature. Some of the factors that we're experiencing right now, which put you at risk for depression, are poverty, unemployment, social isolation, stressful life events, for example, death, loss of a loved one, people who abuse substances. They are at greater risk for depression. And one of the things to know about depression is that over 50% of people who have depression also have anxiety. And an unfortunate statistic to be able to tell you is that 60% of those who die by suicide have had depression. But there's hope. And so there's hope because there's several different things that we can do to mitigate those risk factors, to weaken those symptoms. And some of the things to think about are, first and foremost, the acknowledgement, which is what former First Lady Michelle Obama did when she disclosed her own life experience. So acknowledging it is important. Being able to talk about it with someone else that you trust, that you feel safe and comfortable with. Exercise has been empirically supported through research to be critical as a strategy or intervention for countering depression and balancing the symptoms that come with depression. One of the exercises that I'd like to call attention to is yoga, mindfulness, meditative practices, but any exercise is something that can be identify the source. Why am I depressed? What has changed in life? Can I isolate that to one specific thing? Once you're able to do that, then thinking about what are the thoughts that I'm entertaining inside of my head or my subconscious that are actually contributing to me feeling the way that I feel. Once you do that, being able to try to reframe or come up with new thoughts that you say to yourself. If none of those things work, then that may be an indicator that you talk to a medical professional. That could be your primary care physician, because they know how to diagnose depression. They also can provide treatment recommendations. And for some of those treatment recommendations would be counseling. And for others, medication-assisted therapy may be needed, which is pharmacology. So I hope that helps to shed a little light about low-grade depression.
Absolutely. There were so many things that I heard, and was some very staggering numbers. You mentioned about comparing men and women are more prone for depression. My question is, and I know this is kind of an ad lib off the cuff, speaking from a Black male perspective, is it that Black men most of us are not as open and as far as in discussing or maybe talking, to where it's not known that men also go through depression as well, as far as the numbers from a standpoint. Because, growing up, when a little boy either falls, hurt himself, is always told the little boy, "Oh boy, don't cry, get up, shake it off, keep moving, type of a thing." So, has there been any studies, around that?
I'm sure there have been some studies. When we look at the etiology of depression, we look at several different demographic factors. So the research just has consistently shown that women are at greater risk of depression than men. The studies do include men, from which this research has been garnered, but certainly there are what we call environmental factors, which is what you were describing about how boys are socialized differently and girls are socialized, that could be contributing. When we think about race and ethnicity, another factor that could be a contributing factor that's not qualified in the research is and the African American community around mental health and being open and transparent about mental health. One of the things that we're historically taught inside of our homes is whatever your business is, to keep it inside of your house, and to not share it with other people. And then, unfortunately, being a native of Alabama, the Tuskegean experiments and that was done there really did harm on African American men in particular. And so there's this caution around seeking professional help, talking to a doctor, because we don't want to be your subject of experimentation. Of course, now there are new parameters and guidelines that have been put into place as a result of that attempt to protect against it. That stigma still carries, and those things are hard to die.
Thank you for sharing that with me. That's some very enlightening information. You mentioned about social isolation, and it's something you were mentioning that inside of your description and response around the low-grade depression. And just to read what I found in regards to the how they define social isolation, it describes the absence of social contact and can lead to loneliness and serious health conditions. It is a state of being cut off from normal social networks, which can be triggered by factors such as loss of mobility, unemployment, or health issues. So, Dr. Griffin, due to COVID, as we mentioned, how do you predict the impact of social isolation will affect us, and how can we lighten the blow of social isolation?
Right. So social isolation is one of the symptoms and signs of depression. And that's whether we're in a pandemic or not. And so now that we're in this pandemic, that increases the risk potential of experiencing social isolation, as well as potential for depression. So one of the things to think about when someone is experiencing social isolation is they could also have poor sleep habits. One of the things with social isolation is impaired cognitive function and cognitive decline. So one of the things I read somewhere the other day that reminded me of the current times that we're in is that, we've been told to socially distance. We've not been told to socially isolate. And I think that's important to draw that distinction, because there are that we connect to one another without isolating ourselves, even if the connection has to come through modalities such as which we're using, technology, that keep us connected to other people. But to answer your question, in terms of the effect, some of the ways it affects us is it affects us physically. And many people are seeing this and that they're not making the link about the COVID weight. We were supposed to work in the winter to get our summer bodies where we wanted them to be so they could be on display, but we were in COVID, right? But actually, one of the effects and impacts of social isolation, there's some physical impacts. And so, jokingly, I'm talking about weight, but that's actually one of them, because sometimes we find comfort in food. And so that's impacts. Another physical impact that when you become less mobile and you attempt to go back into an active lifestyle, sometimes that's difficult. If you ever watch My 600-Pound Life, you see the threat of being immobile for a long period of time. And then when you need to be mobile, the impact that has. So the same is true in terms of impact and effect with social isolation. It places you too at increased risk for premature death. So people who are socially isolated, research has shown that they're at greater risk to die earlier than what they should have based on lifespan study. With this, one of the things to think about is your thoughts and the types of thoughts that you're having, and trying to be purposeful and intentional and engaging with other people. Again, you might not do that face to face. You may have to just pick up the phone, create a space through any of the platforms that allow for video communication. But again, there are ways that we can socially distance, yet be safe and not socially isolate. For example, many people are working from home right now. So we created these pseudo home offices, but take your work outside, whether that's on the front of your home, the back of your home, at a table outside at Panera Bread or Starbucks, or wherever you feel comfortable. But take it outside. Being in nature alone, even if you're not interacting with anybody else, quells that potential for social isolation. So I think part of it is that when we become more inward focused, and that decreases our ability to communicate effectively with others. So those are some of the ways that I think the impacts will be seen that are in addition to the normal kind of effects of social isolation.
Wow. Didn't have any thoughts that social isolation could be such an impact on people's lives. We're so, pre-COVID, it's so easy for us to, if we wanted to, we had the power and we could make a decision about, going out. If we wanted to go out after work, if we wanted to hit a happy hour spot or go out to dinner with some girlfriends or guy friends or other couples, we could do that. Travel with ease with either driving or taking a flight from, Atlanta to Fiji or wherever it is that we're going to. All of that's at a standstill. So it's really impacted, and never knew about, how would life look without being able to make those type of choices. But we're experiencing it right now. But you gave some very great tips about how to combat it. Another term that I recently heard, had never heard it before, was imposter syndrome. I'd never heard that term before. I mean, I know what imposter is, and I know what a syndrome is, but never have heard those words combined. What is it, and what steps can we take to avoid or stop it?
So, I think that terminology is just entering kind of into our mainstream society, but believe it or not, it was first coined in the 1970s. And it was coined and first associated actually with women with high performing jobs. And so what it means, the imposter syndrome, people who experience this typically experience it associated with work or an academic environment where there's a feeling of inadequacy. This success, there's nothing that actually connects to you are inadequate. It's just the feeling of it. And it's in relationship to success and in relationship to, again, whether it's work, academic, or some other type of setting. And it's the notion or the personal disbelief that I can't believe I'm here. And that I'm not sufficient to do what I'm doing. So many times, students that I work with at the university, they experience imposter syndrome, especially those that are working on doctoral degrees. It's a level of self-doubt. And I've not looked at the research to see kind of based on race and ethnic factors, but I know several of the African American students that I come in contact with suffer from this. I've actually also at least one client, she was Caucasian female, who she experienced this. And what people end up feeling is like they're intellectual frauds, that they're being fraudulent in some way. And in this particular client's experience, when we kind of peel back the layers of the onion, so to speak, what we found is that early on in her career, she was able to garner opportunity that were basically given to her that she did not have to compete for. And that really contributed to her feeling like she was fraudulent in the profession where she is now. So, I mean, this was years ago, and she had never even thought about it until we talked about, this inadequacy that she feels at work. The way to begin to address this really is mindset. So, mindset is everything. So you can have two people in the same conditions, and there's been several twin studies and sibling studies of this. They can be raised in the same environmental conditions, and one is highly successful and the other is not. And part of that is the mindset. So mindset is everything when it comes to imposter. And that's beginning to tell yourself out loud, I'm supposed to be here. Better than me to be doing what I'm doing. One of the things to also be mindful of is peer comparisons do not help whatsoever when it comes to imposter syndrome. So you have to discontinue any comparison of yourself to your colleagues and to your peers, because that could further reinforce this inadequacy that someone is feeling. One thing that's suggested is to track against your own goals. So measure success against the lane that you're in or the race that you're running. It's necessary to have self-compassion and to be able to forgive yourself, because there's, to some extent, any slight failure, misstep further reinforces this concept that I'm not supposed to be here. So that's where self-compassion kicks in. Everybody makes mistakes. We don't always hit them. Sometimes your project isn't going to be the project that's chosen at work. You're not going to always get a 100 on your paper. Sometimes you're going to get an 85. Does it still allow you to graduate, which is the goal? Yeah. So track against your own goals. Then look back. We all have a history. We all have a record of successes. And sometimes we have to look back over those to remind ourselves, again, I'm supposed to be here. I'm equipped. And when you do fail, or when you do miss a step, to fail with grace. And I think that's where the self-compassion kind of kicks in.
Wow, that is some very impactful information. It's quite often, we hear someone who says, well, why me? Especially normally it's you hear it when something good is happening, and someone says, well, why me? And why not you? So many times we have to remind ourselves about that. And as you mentioned, you wonderful information about the mindset and how important it is. Thank you very much for that. A few days ago, and you and I spoke about this prior to getting on to this recording, I came across some information about, it was very interesting and a little disturbing, as well. It was about the federal government and their partnership with Yale. They are holding clinical trials to figure out or to identify how to best persuade Americans into taking the COVID-19 vaccine once it becomes available. This sounds a little bit like psychological conditioning. What are your thoughts on this topic?
One of the things that's necessary with being able to introduce any kind of medication, even in introduction of a clinical strategy such as mindfulness, yoga, the use of exercise to attend to depression. They have to do, research is necessary to do that if you want to have it empirically supported, to evidence that it's actually effective and not a waste of anyone's time. So those same things are required when we look at vaccinations and in the field of medicine. Most clinical trials I've never seen a clinical trial that's not voluntary. And at any point within a clinical trial, you're supposed to be able to opt out. Going into any kind of clinical research, you are supposed to be provided with safeguards information, the risk, the harm, what to do in the event you experience those factors associated with risk and harm. But I've not seen use the word to persuade. And so I'm just wondering if that terminology was used because of where we are with the pandemic and not really seeing any end in mind beyond looking at preventative medication, which is what a vaccine would be. So I would hope that we are not persuaded in a way that doesn't honor the laws and regulations that have been put in place because of things such as the Tuskegee experiment. Because we don't want to see those consequences because they were so great.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing your thoughts about it. You mentioned about being the counselor's counselor, the friend's friend, and the champion's champion. What are there any gold nuggets that you could share with us about how and what the professionals do to combat depression and anxiety?
So, some of the things that people do to combat it. One is just the awareness that depression and anxiety are very common. that's why from the onset, I gave you those statistics, 1 in 10. And to let you know that so that you could be realistic about something that you might experience. So one of the things is that people are aware that it's common. That lets them know that they're not alone. And neither of those diagnoses are death sentences if they're acknowledged and addressed. So some of the things that the professionals do is diet and exercise, deep breathing techniques. That comes with, that's I first learned about paying attention to how you breathe in a yoga class. But when I was in the military, we had to, have a certain physical requirement related to running. And even when you run, breathing is important to how you experience the fatigue and your ability to sustain. So breathing is one of the techniques that professionals use. Mindfulness is another. Mindfulness is just being in the present moment. So many times when we're all guilty of this and this technology influence age and period of time, but just say you're out to dinner with a friend, or you go grab a cup of coffee or a scoop of ice cream. Most people at some point during that experience are going to be on in social media, text, and that means that you're not actually mindful. So when you're practicing mindfulness, you are fully attuned to the time that you're in the present. So being aware of that, because it's so important with anxiety, because really anxiety is a projection of concern in the future. And none of us have that crystal ball. We don't know what the future. The professionals also use coaching. They use peer accountability. They check in with someone. Several people use counseling in the same way that they use their gym membership. So I have some clients that I call kind of lifetime clients. They almost want to keep me on retainer just so that whenever they need me, they can check in. Versus seeing counseling as something to lament, to avoid. Or to mean that there's something wrong with them. So those are some of the things that the professionals do to kind of mitigate depression and anxiety.
Those are wonderful tips. Thank you very much. That was more than some golden nuggets, out of that. I appreciate it. How can our viewers contact you? You mentioned about you have clients and know that that are national across the globe. So how can our viewers contact you, if they want more information?
I think the easiest way, I have a website, and it's just mgconsultation.com. I'm also in several social media spaces, but again, the easiest way, you access that website, there's a contact card there. The social spaces that I'm in are also listed and hyperlinked, so I can be contacted.
Thank you very much, Dr. Griffin. I appreciate it. I hope that you and your family and friends and associates continue to be healthy and well. Our viewers, if you found this video to be helpful and informative, please like or subscribe to the page. And please continue to live healthy, well, and prosper fairly. Until next time, have a fantastic day.